All right, today we're diving into a really fascinating political system, one that was born during one of the most chaotic periods you can imagine in Middle Eastern history. It's an incredible story about how a completely new way of holding power didn't just survive, but actually thrived and ended up shaping the entire region for centuries.
So, here's the big question, the real puzzle we're going to tackle. The era between, say, the years 1000 and 1250. It was just a time of unbelievable turmoil. And yet somehow, out of that fire, a political blueprint emerged that was so stable and so influential, it became the gold standard for hundreds of years. So how on earth does that happen?
And when I say turmoil, I really mean it. This wasn't just one problem, it was a perfect storm. You had these massive invasions of nomadic warriors just pouring in from the Asian steppes. At the exact same time, you have the Crusades kicking off from Europe. Internally, the old political order had completely shattered into a million tiny pieces. And then, to cap it all off, the whole period ends with the Mongol invasions, which brought a level of destruction that was, well, it was just off the charts. It's pretty much the last place on Earth you'd expect to find a recipe for stability. So let's dig into this paradox. Who could possibly build something that lasts in a world that seems like it's literally falling apart at the seams? Well, the answer is not what you'd expect. The innovators here, they weren't experienced government officials or powerful emperors sitting in palaces. Nope. They were the Seljuk Turks, pastoralist warriors who started out as raiders on the edge of the Islamic world. In a lot of ways, they were the chaos, and yet somehow they became the architects of a whole new kind of order. And that brings us to this huge, critical decision the Seljuk leaders had to make right after their first big victories. Because, conquering a place is one thing, but actually ruling it, that's a whole different ballgame. And this slide just lays out their dilemma perfectly. After they took over the cities in a region called Khorasan, they basically had two choices. Option 1, stick to what they knew. Plunder everything, turn the farmland into pasture for their animals, and just move on. It's the classic nomad playbook, but it would have completely destroyed the very wealth they just fought to capture. Option 2 was something totally new. Stay, rule, and rebuild. But that meant they'd have to become kings, hold down territory, and that was incredibly risky. It could tick off their own tribal followers, who were really just there for the loot, and it basically painted a giant target on their backs for every other ambitious warlord in the region. So, to make that jump from raiding chieftain to ruling king, the Seljuks had to completely change who they were. First off, they needed a whole new worldview. They adopted Sunni Islam, which gave them a sense of universal mission, and maybe most importantly, a source of legitimacy that went way beyond just being a successful tribal leader. Second, they had to build a new kind of army. You can't have a full-time military that's also a society of shepherds, so they had to give up their flocks and figure out totally new ways to recruit and, crucially, pay their soldiers. And third, their whole philosophy of war had to evolve, from just chaotic raiding to the organized, disciplined use of force to achieve very specific political goals. So, with all these massive challenges, the Seljuks didn't just dust off some old imperial handbook. They had to invent something new from the ground up. And this is what they came up with: the military patronage state. Now, the key thing to get here is that the Seljuks didn't try to build a huge top-down government to control every little thing. Instead, they ruled by handing out power. They gave their key supporters, their generals, their top officials, influential religious figures, direct control over chunks of revenue in exchange for their loyalty and service. It was a really flexible, decentralized system built on a whole network of personal patronage. Okay, so how did they actually pay that brand new army? They used this incredible tool called the ikta. Now, this wasn't like a feudal fief in Europe where you're given the land itself. No, this was a grant of the revenue from the land. A commander would get an ikta, and he'd use the taxes and income from that area to pay his own soldiers directly. I mean, this was a genius solution to their cash flow problem. The government didn't need a massive central bank. The army basically paid for itself at the local level. And they had an equally smart solution for controlling the cities, which could be really complicated, chaotic places. They used something called the Waqf, a kind of religious charitable fund. The rulers would set aside properties to fund things like schools, called madrasas. And who ran these powerful institutions? The ulama, the respected religious scholars who had huge sway in the cities. So by funding the ulama, the Seljuks turned these local power brokers into their allies. They were basically ruling the cities indirectly through this network of religious patronage. So let's just put all the pieces together. You've got these three main pillars. The ikta takes care of funding the army without needing a giant central government. The Waqf keeps the cities under control by working with the local religious elites. And then, to make sure they stayed in charge, the rulers built up their own personal armies of Mamluks. These were elite professional slave soldiers who were loyal only to the ruler himself. This gave the Sultan a reliable professional force to counterbalance the power of his own wild Turkoman tribal followers, the very guys who brought him to power in the first place. And look, this wasn't just some idea on paper. This political blueprint got seriously stress-tested all across the Middle East for more than 200 years, and it turned out to be incredibly adaptable and shockingly effective. You can actually trace how this idea spread. The Seljuks create the system in Iran and Iraq. Then, a dynasty called the Zingids picks it up to unify Syria and launch the first real counter-crusade. Their successor, the famous Saladin, uses the exact same model to bring Egypt and Syria together under his Ayyubid dynasty, which lets him eventually retake Jerusalem. And finally, the Mamluks, the slave soldiers themselves, end up taking power in Egypt and just perfecting the whole system, creating the most powerful and long-lasting version of the military patronage state. So, what was the ultimate payoff for perfecting this system? Well, think about the Mongol war machine. It had seemed absolutely unstoppable, crushing civilizations from China all the way to Eastern Europe. But in 1260, at a battle called Ain Jalut, the army of the Mamluk Sultanate, an army funded by Iktas and led by former slaves, did what nobody else could. They stopped the Mongol advance cold. It was the ultimate proof that this system worked. You know, this system wasn't just a flash in the pan. Its legacy was huge because it was a totally new way of organizing power, designed for a new, much more broken up kind of world. Okay, this table really breaks it down for us. The earlier Arab Caliphate was our classic ancient empire, super centralized, all the money flowing to a state treasury, or diwan, and their tribal soldiers were forced to settle down in towns. The Seljuk model was the total opposite. Revenue was decentralized through the Ikta. Their tribal soldiers got to stay nomads, and the state itself wasn't one single government. The source material calls it a collection of powerful households, all held together by the Sultan. It was just less rigid, way more flexible, and perfectly built for a chaotic, fragmented world. And this quote from our source, the historian Michael Chamberlain, just nails it. The Seljuks and the dynasties that followed didn't rebuild the old unified empire. That was impossible. Instead, they created a system that allowed the idea of that empire, its culture, its laws, its religion, to survive and even flourish in a world that was constantly flying apart. They figured out how to manage fragmentation instead of being destroyed by it. So we end up right back where we started, thinking about how you forge order from chaos. The military patronage state was a system of, you could call it, organized fragmentation. It worked not by forcing everyone into a single mold, but by cleverly managing a decentralized network of power. It balanced all these competing interests for centuries, in one of the most volatile times in history. Which kind of leaves us with this big question to think about. In our own turbulent times, what can we learn from a model like this about building systems that are not just strong, but flexible and resilient enough to actually last?